My name is Debbie Ginsberg, and I am the Faculty Services Manager at the Harvard Law Library. Hello and welcome to everyone here. Welcome to the Harvard Law School Library Book Talk series. This talk is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel sometime after, look for it in the next few weeks. Check out our Scholarship at Law blog for more information about these and other book talks. A big thank you to Dean Manning for his generous support of these talks, and another big thank you to our team, Maya Bergamasco, Rachel Parker, and Teresa Knapp for putting together the series. We welcome questions for our speaker and invite you to use the Q&A feature throughout the talk. In fact, that's going to be the biggest part of today's talk. So please have your questions ready, and our speaker will be able to answer anything you have to ask. There's plenty of time reserved for the speaker to engage with your questions. Also, please visit your local library or your local bookseller for a copy of today's book, Say It Out Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. It is my pleasure to introduce today's author, Randall Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law here at Harvard. He teaches courses on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. Professor Kennedy has written or contributed to 30 books and over 90 articles for a wide range of scholarly and general interest publications, including The Nation, The American Prospect, The Atlantic, The New Republic, Harper's, London Review of Books, and The New York Times. Professor Kennedy, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. I want to express my thanks to the library for making this forum available to me and to all of us. I also want to express my deep appreciation to the library staff, because the staff is just so helpful. And in this crisis over the last year and a half, the library staff has been just magnificent in continuing to support my work and the work of my colleagues. One of the favorite moments I have in writing a book is at the very end. At the very end, I write the acknowledgments. And in all of the books that I've done, I make a point of acknowledging the library staff, particularly the reference librarians. They're just remarkably helpful, and I want to express my thanks. So what brings us here today is a book that was published, about 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's a book called Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. It's a book of essays. I've never written a book of essays before, but it's a book of essays, 29 essays. And these essays were written over the past 25 years. Many of the essays have been published before, in various publications, the New York Times or Harper's, London Review, The Atlantic, The American Prospect, The Nation. But I revised all of them. I updated, sometimes I corrected, sometimes I apologized for things I have said in the past that I've reconsidered. So the book is these 29 essays. They range over just a wide terrain. All of them have to do with the race question in American life. And when I subside in a few minutes, I'll be happy to field questions, comments, and by all means, objections to anything I say, or I'd be happy to take the conversation wherever you'd like to take the conversation. But let me spend a few minutes on a couple of essays that I think might be of particular interest to the Harvard Law School community. The second essay in the book actually is an essay that has never been previously published. It's an essay called Derek Bell and Me. And I think it might be of particular interest to the Harvard Law School community, because Derek Bell was the first Black tenured professor at Harvard Law School. He's been in the news a lot lately because of the controversy over critical race theory. Derek Bell is often viewed as the sort of godfather of critical race theory. And he was a controversial figure. He left the law school. He delivered an ultimatum to the law school. He said, listen, law school, you better appoint a tenured or tenure track Black woman to the professorial ranks. And if you don't do this within a certain amount of time, I'm going to leave. Well, he left, and he spent about the last decade of his life at the New York University Law School. Derek Bell and I had a very interesting relationship. It was close in certain ways, but it was vexed in other ways. It was close. He was my senior, and he was very generous to me, very helpful to me. I took over his class. He was the pioneer of a class here at the law school called Race, Racism, and American Life. Race, Racism in American Law. And when he left to become the dean of the University of Oregon Law School. When he left, I came here and I started teaching that class and have taught it, or versions of it, ever since. Initially, we were close, not only personally, but also it's just in terms of our scholarship. But that changed because I became rather critical of certain things that he had written. And there was one article I wrote in particular, an article called Racial Critiques of Legal Academia. I think it appeared in 1989. And it was a critique of things that he had written, and Charles Lawrence, Mari Matsuda, some of the people who were associated with critical race theory. And I wrote this article, and it was very critical. And he wrote me a letter, and he urged me not to publish this piece because he thought that enemies of critical race theory would use it as a cudgel to attack that movement. Well, I did publish the piece, and that angered him very much. And for a good long time, we didn't talk very much, and to the extent that we did communicate in public, it was through pretty barbed communication. In any event, this essay is my effort to revisit Derek Bell and to revisit our relationship. And in the piece, I try to take on his thinking. I try to take on our relationship. And for me, it was a very moving piece. I went to New York University Library to consult his papers. His papers are there. I spent a couple of days going through his papers, and left going through his papers and rereading his articles and just thinking about him. And I left. I have a higher opinion of him now than I did back then. And I'm sorry that I didn't give him, I think, his due back then. and I try to give him his due in this essay. So that's one of the essays that means the most to me, actually, Derek Bell and Me. Let me pair that against another essay. There's an essay called, in this collection, called Why Clarence Thomas Ought to Be Ostracized. And it's a very harsh critique of Justice Thomas. And I basically set forth the proposition that Justice Thomas has crossed a line that should prompt people to give him the cold shoulder. I basically accuse Justice Thomas of participating in actions as a justice that are not only wrong, but are profoundly wrong. I view him really as not only an adversary, but an enemy of Black America. Now, I think some people will be surprised by that because, or at least surprised that I say that, because that's really in tension, in very sharp tension with much of what I've written and much of what's written in Say It Loud, because I'm, generally speaking, a real proponent of openness and pluralism and, debate, contention. I'm all for it. But in this essay, I suggest that there are always lines that have to be drawn. If you're going to have a community, if you're going to have an entity, even an imagined entity like Black America, if you believe that there is such a thing as Black America, then that, it seems to me, you have to believe that there is a boundary around Black America, and that someone can step outside of that boundary and legitimately be viewed as an enemy. I think there are many people who will probably disagree with me on that, and like I said, I'd be happy to go back and forth and talk about that when I subside. But those are two essays that I think are particularly meaningful to me. Let me mention a couple more. Some of these pieces stem from arguments that I've had with people. So, if I'm at a dinner, let's say, if I'm at a dinner and there's a good, strong argument, I'll get a piece of paper and write down notes about that argument. Several of the essays in this collection stem from arguments. Here's one. A number of years ago, I was giving a lecture in one of my classes, and a student held up her hand, and I called on her, and she said, Professor Kennedy, you used the word Negro. Are you using that so as to, are you using that in the context, in the historical context that you're talking about, so that you won't be anachronistic? Is that the way in which you're using it? Or are you using the word? Are you, in your own voice, using this word to describe African Americans? I said, that's an interesting observation. I'm doing both, but I am using this in my own voice. And she then said, well, I object. I strongly object. I think that the use of the word Negro in this day and age is derogatory. And so I said, well, I'll note that. Let me think about this, and then let me get back to you. And then a couple of weeks later, I gave a lecture on the history of names by which, collective names by which Black Americans have defined themselves over the course of American history. And I gave that as a lecture, and one of the essays in this collection is based on that lecture. One of the things I pointed out to the student, I said, you know, I can tell you the time at which I actually started using the term Negro. I can actually date it in my own life. And I started using the word Negro consistently in 1983, 1984. And the reason why I started using the word Negro had to do with my boss. I was clerking for a judge, and the judge said, I used the word, use the word Negro, capital N, because I turned in a memo, some civil rights case, and I had referred to the party in the case as, African American, or maybe I referred to a party as Black American. He said, Negro, capital N. Who was that person? That person was Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall. I clerked for Thurgood Marshall in the 1983-84 Supreme Court term. Well, I guess my bottom line is if Negro was good enough for Thurgood Marshall, if Negro was good enough for Martin Luther King Jr., if Negro was good enough for W.E.B. Du Bois, if Negro was good enough for Medgar Evers, if Negro was good enough for Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer, it's good enough for me. And but I gave a lecture, and then, like I said, there's an essay in the book about just the history of controversies involving these various terms: Negro, colored, African American, the rest. One last essay I'll mention, and then see what questions you might have. Like I said, there are a couple of places in the book where I revisit things that I've written in the past. A number of years ago, I think it was the 100th anniversary of the Harvard Law Review, there was an oral history, an oral history that featured a man by the name of Philip Ellman. Philip Ellman, I forget what class, he was an HLS alum. He was in the Solicitor General's office for a good long time. He then was a member of the Federal Trade Commission. Very, very distinguished person. Well, like I said, in the 100th anniversary volume of the Harvard Law Review, there was featured an interview with Ellman. And in this interview, Ellman talked about how at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, he was in the Solicitor General's office, and he talked about his interactions with Justice Frankfurter. And this became somewhat controversial because it was clear that he was talking to Frankfurter in a way that was probably improper, given that this was a pending case before the Supreme Court. He was in the Solicitor General's office. The Solicitor General participated in the case. There was another aspect that became controversial. Philip Ellman had some very tough things to say about, very critical things to say about the lawyers who represented the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. And the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund called me up and said, have you read this thing by Phil Ellman? And I said, well, no. And he says, well, I want you to read it. And I did. And then I got back in touch with him. Julius Chambers was the head of the Legal Defense Fund then, very distinguished lawyer. And Julius Chambers said, we really don't like the way that Philip Ellman talked about Thurgood Marshall and Robert Carter and Spotswood Robinson and some of the other lawyers who participated in this case. He put them down, and he brought himself, he became the hero. And we want a response. And I'd like for you to write the response. And I took this on as basically a brief. And I wrote a response. It was published in the Harvard Law Review, and it was very critical of Philip Ellman. And one of the things that I suggested in my critique of Philip Ellman is I've insinuated, it might have been even more than an insinuation, but at the very least, it was the insinuation that Philip Ellman had said what he said, at least in part, out of racial prejudice. And in the subsequent years, I've gone back to the essay, I've thought about it, and I wish that I had not said that. I think that Ellman was wrong in the way in which he did minimize the great lawyers of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And I think that he did show unseemly vanity in putting himself sort of front and center. But I wish that I had not suggested that racial prejudice was part of what was animating him. And I used this essay to take back what I said, and also to say, in 1954, whatever else you want to say about Philip Ellman was on the good side. Philip Ellman was a very skillful, very impassioned spokesperson for those who were seeking to invalidate segregation and other forms of invidious discrimination. And for that, Ellman is entitled to respect and he's entitled to gratitude. And I use that essay to say that. Well, I'll subside for now and see if there are any questions or comments or, like I say, objections that the audience might have.
Professor Kennedy, thank you so much for sharing more about this book. So as Professor Kennedy said, we're now going to move into the Q&A portion of this talk. So for our audience, we encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit questions, and we will try and get to as many as we can. So Professor Kennedy, our first question for you: when there are so few well-publicized, widely read, and known publications by Black scholars, what is your approach for staying true to your research, findings, own experience, while realizing how your words may inform how white cultures receive your works and others' works?
Yeah. I think that, when you write something, when you publish something, it goes out into the world and people are going to use it in all sorts of different ways. And you're not going to be able to really cabin what they do. I'm not going to be able to control what somebody does with what I write. So I try to be as careful, I try to be as precise as I can be, but I also I don't want to inhibit myself too much. And in fact, I don't want to inhibit myself at all. I want to clarify my thinking and reach my conclusions and put it out there as part of an ongoing conversation. And I don't really worry a whole lot about what people are going to do because I can't control that. I can control what I write, and I try to do the best that I can, and then we see what happens.
Great, thank you. We also have another thought from the audience. So from an audience member, what we call ourselves will continue to change with the generations until there is real justice. So I anticipate being called and calling myself different things over time. I was born Negro in 1954 when that was quote unquote new for many who thought colored was without harm. Just some thoughts, not a question. So if you have a response to that.
Yeah, well, this person, we share that great year, 1954. I was born in 1954. And, you know, these various terms, Negro. Let me read you the first sentence of Say It Loud, because the first sentence of Say It Loud actually touches on this. The writings that follow are the impressions of a black, Negro, colored, African-American law professor born in Columbia, South Carolina in 1954, 4 months after the Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education. So that's right. As far as I'm concerned, you know, these various terms, and I'm sure that there will probably be more, so long as they are uttered with respect, they are all okay with me, including colored. I know that for some people, they really dislike that one, but, you know, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's a wonderful organization. I'm completely open to all of these terms and others. I think that sometimes folks become all too wrapped up in fashion, and I really am quite allergic to people telling me what language I should use when, frankly, they haven't taken the time to even investigate the history of the language that they're talking about. Others?
Yes, our next question. So from an audience member, I can't wait to read this book. I work in the library and my colleagues and I know how much material you work through during your research. Perhaps could you offer a word about your research methodology and how you make it through such large amounts of material with what seems to be such unflagging energy?
Well, number one, I have one of the great privileges of my life is that I get to work on things that I love working on. So, you know, I can't wait in the morning after, you know, when I wake up, I can't wait to get to the desk. In the evening when I start to tire, I'm really sorry that I get tired and that I have to, you know, go to sleep. I love what I do. And, you know, what a privilege. And that's what really propels my efforts. So I love what I do. It's great fun. It has put me in touch with all sorts of people. One of the things about books, you know, books go everywhere, and I get emails and letters from people from the you know all over, prisoners, seminarians, other teachers, and you know it's great. It's what an incentive. As for my methodology, that is something of a mystery to me. I mean, to tell you the truth, I don't know really how I get these things done. I'm not a very organized person, and I know that I'm not well organized, and so I do I take lots of precautions. So I have lots of fail safes. I never, if I write something, I make sure that there are, lots of copies of it. My assistant has a copy. I like it. I like a setup in which there is a copy and I don't even know where it is, so that I can't lay my hands on it. So that if something happens, there's the most recent version of what I've done is someplace, and my assistants, who are wonderful, have really helped me with that. But I believe in motion. I just, one thing leads to another, leads to another, leads to another. And I just think of it in terms of, just every day get something done, every day get something done, every day get something done. And there does come a moment, there comes a day, with every one of these books that I've done, there comes a day in which I have the feeling, I think you're done. And oftentimes it's, gosh, I think you're done. In fact, I think you were done 2 weeks ago. And it'll be done, and that's it. I'll ship it off to my editor, and the book will then go in production.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, a few more questions here. The next question. It seems like there is a significant overlap between critical race theory and history as it actually happened. Do you have thoughts about the efforts to ban its teaching in public schools in this country?
Sure, I do. I think that the campaign against critical race theory that we saw this summer and that is ongoing is terrible. I mean, these laws that have been passed that would punish educators, punish school districts that acquainted students with, critical race theory. I think that's what kind of education is that? What kind of lesson does that? What kind of lesson is that for students? I've been very critical of certain aspects of critical race theory and remain rather critical of certain aspects of critical race theory. But I certainly think that people should read it. So for one thing, there's much in critical race theory that's excellent. I mean, number one, if what is critical race theory? What are the basic ideas? One very basic idea, probably the central idea, is the basic notion that race and racism has been central in American life. Not only has it been central, it's been pervasive in American life, from the most public aspects of American life, voting, jury service, to the most intimate aspects of life, sex, marriage, adoption. I mean, that's a very central thing with people who call themselves critical race theorists. A second feature of critical race theory, at least as many people who call themselves critical race theorists put it, is the notion that conventional anti-discrimination law has been inadequate as a way of creating a racially just society. Well, frankly, I believe both of those things. And not only that, I think that there are a lot of people who don't call themselves critical race theorists who believe those two things. Now, there's some people who call themselves critical race theorists who launch into other ideas. So, for instance, Derek Bell. Derek Bell took the position late in his career that there had really been no appreciable change in the status of African Americans over the course of, the past century. Well, it seems to me that that's just, untenable. What are you talking about? I can imagine one saying that there have been continuities in racism that are profoundly disturbing. I think it's tenable for somebody to say that there has been far less change than one would have wanted, but no change. Well, what does one do about Barack Obama being president of the United States for 8 years? Or for that matter, what does one do about the current vice president of the United States, the current head of the Defense Department? I mean, clearly there has been change. Clearly there has been what should be deemed appreciable change. So the idea that there's really been no change, it seems to me that that's just not well taken. Another aspect of critical race theory, and I should say another aspect of what some critical race theorists embrace, because critical race theory is, complicated. People in that camp disagree among themselves. There's some people who call themselves critical race theorists who have been, in my view, all too complacent with respect to civil liberties. I think of Mari Matsuda. I think of Richard Delgado. Basically taking the position that racist speech, racist expression, should be suppressed. The great irony, of course, is that right now there are people who want to repress critical race theory on the grounds that it's racist. It seems to me that some critical race theory people can learn a lesson from what has transpired. I think that one ought to protect expression, protect speech, protect thinking, even when one is very critical of that thinking. So I'm extremely critical of the recent attack on critical race theory, because actually it's not just an attack on critical race theory, it's an attack on critical thinking. It's an attack on thought itself.
Great, thank you. Our next question from the audience. Alice Walker's The Color Purple came out when I was living in San Francisco. Even strangers would come up on me with intensity and tell me Walker was out of her mind and filled with hate to throw all Black men under the bus. At the time, I would reply that white people know that I Love Lucy doesn't define all white women. But there are so few voices that any Black voice seems forced to speak for all. This is improper, and we just need to get the diversity of our experiences out there. Over the decades, I've changed my mind about different aspects of those conversations. What is our responsibility? Even my husband, all these years later, says it's clear Walker, quote unquote, hates Black men. Mr. is a monster. There's no way we can be everything to everybody. So what do you think our obligations are when we're unpacking texts?
I think that, again, one shouldn't allow certain popular pathologies to intimidate one. No person can be the spokesperson for, a large set of people who have all sorts of ideas. I think the speaker was absolutely right in saying that, Black Americans have all sorts of thoughts, some good, some bad. There are all sorts of tensions. There's all sorts of conflict within Black America. And people ought to be attentive to that and more knowledgeable about that. So, yeah, there's Alice Walker, and, she has her partisans and she has her critics. And just as is the case with artists of, hailing from other precincts, the same is true of Philip Roth. The same is true of Saul Bellow. It should, Black American culture is complex and wide and, riven, and that's the way it is. And I would hope that people would study enough to know that and to act accordingly.
Great, thank you. One more question from the audience. Is the no appreciable change in racial progress a position taken because it's sensational and will get attention, regardless of what the fuller scholarship might be saying? Some scholars seem to want name recognition more so than the more careful language they might use if we had more readers' thoughtful attention.
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, one of my favorite historians is Richard Hofstadter. Wonderful historian. He was a professor at Columbia University. And Richard Hofstadter once said that any good idea should be able to bear the strain of overstatement. And I think there's something to that. The world's a noisy place. People are saying all sorts of things. And if you want to get notice, sometimes you feel like you have to stand on tippy toe. And you think about, well, how can I put this in a way that will get attention for my idea? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, after all, take a look at the newspaper. What are newspaper headlines? Newspaper headlines are efforts to grab readers' attention. I think there's nothing wrong with seeking to grab readers' attention. So there's nothing wrong with a certain amount of sensationalism. If you are a writer, you spend a lot of time doing your thing, putting down on paper, your ideas. You want people to read your ideas, react to your ideas. And so, there's going to be this impulse to push your idea in a way that'll get at least a second look. So it doesn't bother me if a writer is self-consciously attempting to be a bit sensational. That doesn't bother me. Now, what does bother me is, so I'm willing to give a lot of leeway to that, actually. Now, after you've gotten the reader's attention, and after you're sort of, you're working your ideas out, then it seems it's a problem if one gets stubborn and if one simply denies counter ideas that one should have to face and explain and grapple with. And I think that the folks who say there's been no change, and you say, well, okay, you say there's been no change, so what? The 1965 Voting Rights Act that led to the registration of several hundreds of thousands of people, you're going to tell me that that wasn't appreciable change? Well, again, I guess we have to talk about what does appreciable mean. But it seems to me that if we're talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, if we're talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the essays in my book is about Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Title II was the part that dealt with public accommodations. And in one of my essays, I talk about how over time, the trips, I was born in Columbia, South Carolina, but I grew up in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Washington, D.C. because my parents were refugees from the Jim Crow South. But we went to South Carolina pretty often. Certainly on major holidays, we'd go to South Carolina. My parents would drive. And I talk about how prior to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we would pack the car in a way you would think that this was a 500-mile trip through enemy territory. Now, as a kid, I was only 8, 9 years old. I didn't really understand what my parents were thinking about. I thought that they were, I thought that they were taking all of these pains just, for fun, to tell you the truth. I didn't know how serious the business was that they were grappling with. I didn't realize how, in their planning, they had to make sure that the car was operating properly. They had to make sure that we had enough to eat because they wanted to minimize our interaction with filling stations. They wanted to make sure that we didn't have to go to any motels or anything like that. They wanted to make sure that they wanted to minimize the risk as much as possible. And in this essay, I talk about how Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act made a real difference because after the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, things changed. We could have an enjoyable trip to South Carolina with a lot less tension, a lot less anxiety. That was a real change. There has been real change. And it seems to me that if you're going to write, with seriousness about the trajectory of race relations in America, one has to take into account continuities. One has to take into account the heartbreaking resiliency of racism in American life. It's true. But to be realistic, one also has to take into account the resiliency of anti-racist impulses, anti-racist campaigns. Both have to be in our minds at the same time.
Thank you. So it looks like we have time for just one more question today. So the last question for you, Professor Kennedy, sort of jumping off what you've just spoken about, where do you see the future of race relations in America?
Well, for most of my adult life, I've been in the optimistic camp in terms of answering the question, shall we overcome? There's an optimistic camp that says yes. And that's an interesting camp. In the 19th century, the great spokesperson for that camp would have been the great Frederick Douglass. In the 20th century, Martin Luther King Jr., see, I Have a Dream, August 1963. In the 21st century, Barack Obama would have been probably the most consequential spokesperson for that point of view. We shall overcome. It's a hopeful point of view. And for much of my adult life, I have been a confident member of that camp. I'm still in that camp, but I am no longer as confident. I'm a chastened optimist. What has led to the chastening? The last few years, in particular, the ascension of Donald Trump to the presidency. 15 years ago, I would have said that no politician with national ambitions would clearly traffic in racial resentment. I mean, clearly trafficked, surely exploited in a clear way. Well, I was wrong. Obviously, I was wrong. And that has been profoundly saddening for me. Now, you know, I have 3 kids. My kids are in their 20s. I have high hopes for them. And so part of this is wishfulness, you know, yearning, faith. But there is more to it than that. The fact of the matter is that across American life, one sees the continuation of progress toward greater racial decency in America. You know, we often take a look at the political sphere for our examples, but there are lots of spheres. I mean, you know, West Point, you know, the commandant of West Point's a Black person. It didn't even rate newspaper coverage. You see Blacks and other people of color coming to the fore in all sorts of different forums, all sorts of different sectors of American life. You see all sorts of people who attack racism, repudiate racism passionately. Think about what happened in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. So there's reason to be disturbed. There's reason to be on guard. There is reason, however, to remain hopeful about the future, and that's where I am. Thank you again so much for hosting me.
Yes, thank you so much. On behalf of the library and the law school, we'd once again like to thank Professor Kennedy for joining us. And thank you to our audience for their thoughtful questions. For some quick closing remarks, I wanted to share about our next law school library talk, which will be next week on Thursday, October 21st at 12:30 for the newly established American Journal of Law and Equality, which is co-founded by Randall Kennedy, Martha Minot, and Chastened. The talk will also feature Professor Kennedy, who will be joined by Professor Martha Minot. You can read more and register for this event on the library website. So please join us next week. Once again, thank you, everyone, and have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.